Welcome everyone who is joining us on YouTube or Zoom for our monthly interview session. Today we are so thrilled at Mikveh Israel in Savannah to have the opportunity to enter a wonderful person who not only does a lot for his community up north, but does a lot for our community in the south, and we'll talk about that in a second. He is a man who is known to many by many different hats. So welcome, Rabbi Kanter, or Rabbi Kenneth A. Kanter. Before beginning his post as, is it officially the executive director, right, of Roots of Reform Judaism?
Rabbinical director.
Rabbinical director. I should know this. I've only been on the board like 7 years.
Yeah, right.
Before becoming the rabbinical director of Roots of Reform Judaism, he served for 15 years as a faculty member at HUC, Hebrew Union College, as associate dean of the rabbinical school. He was born in Chicago, received his BA and Jewish and American history from a college called Harvard. He was also ordained from HUC and got his Doctor of Divinity. In 2005, he concluded 26 years as a congregational rabbi, serving as founding rabbi of Congregation Micah in Nashville, Tennessee, a wonderful rabbi. We know people have served there before. He was senior rabbi of Chattanooga's Mitzvah congregation and assistant rabbi of Ohabai Shalom in Nashville. He's also served as a Jewish chaplain and adjunct professor at Vanderbilt, but he is known in many other circles because of his books and of his ability to lecture so brilliantly. He's written books, he's written journals, articles, and he has written quite a bit, contributing, and not only, but certainly to American popular music history. Among these books are The Jews of the Tin Pan Alley, which I've read, which is a fabulous book, Jewish American History and Culture, and the Encyclopedia of Jewish American Popular Culture. He's married to Dr. Tony Sklar Kanter. They have 3 children, 1 grandson, and 1 granddaughter. And I hope I got that all correct. Welcome. What I didn't say in there, because it's not an official bio, he also is the rabbi for the group in Bluffton. He comes down, or you come down once a month still? Yep. Once a month in Bluffton. For those of you who are visiting from elsewhere, is in the southern part of South Carolina. So you just got to go across the border and they're there, and we have a wonderful community there. He's connected to our community as the rabbinical director of the Roots of Reform Judaism because he, of course, is the rabbi in Sun City, because of the history books he's written, and because he's friends with probably 63.5% of our congregation. So welcome to Rabbi Kanter. We're so thrilled to have you here. What we're going to do now is I'm going to ask a question or two as we start. We're going to learn a little bit about his history, and then we'll spend some time on the organization. But we're going to invite anybody who is on Zoom to just raise your hand, or just put the reaction hand up if you want to ask some questions. So Rabbi Kanter, so tell us a little bit about your childhood and what led you to go into this field.
Well, let me start with saying thank you for the privilege of being with you. As I look at my screen, pretty much everybody I can see is either from the congregation in Bluffton or connected with Roots of Reform. And I'm really delighted about that. Some of you are both Mikveh Israel people and members of Temple Osei Shalom in Bluffton. And to all of you, it's really a joy to be part of this. Not to mention to say something about your rabbi and my friend, Rabbi Haas. He has been very gracious in all these kind words about my career. And he and I have something in common, I think, and that is that he and I are 2 of the most successful rabbis who have combined entertainment and our rabbinical careers. Now, mine was a little bit more serious when it began, but it's not many people that can say they are the funniest rabbi in the entire country. And certainly you already know that from the Mikveh Israel community. But my career started out in rabbinical school. And I have to tell you that story, a little background. As Robert said, I grew up in Chicago. My dad was in television broadcasting, so we moved around quite a bit. So we lived in Chicago, Cleveland, Miami, Albany, New York. Then I went to Harvard, as Robert said, and right from there went to Jerusalem to begin my rabbinical school training, then to Cincinnati. And then my entire rabbinic career has been in Southern congregations. Nashville, Chattanooga, and now in South Carolina. So I've been very much part of the Southern rabbinic world and have loved that all these years and continue to do so. Now, Robert mentioned my work in American popular music. Now, you may wonder, where does a rabbi get into that field? And it's sort of like kind of a crazy question, knowing that Robert is a comedian. So he's done that field so beautifully. And my career started in a different way. Excuse me. I did a lot of theater and music when I was at Harvard and went to rabbinical school where we were required to write a paper on, or I should make a presentation in a field of modern Jewish thought. And I was thinking in rabbinical school in Jerusalem, what did I know that the rest of my student classmates didn't know better than I did? And certainly there were Hebrew scholars that were way better in Hebrew than I, and historians, all these things. I said, the one thing I know is I could do a talk on the role of Jews in American popular music. So I came home for winter break from Israel back to the United States, went to my record collection. This generation knows what records are. If I give this talk to kids in Sunday school, they look at me like, what's a record? Anyway, I recorded on a little cassette recording, and you all know what that is. Our kids don't. But I put together Ethel Merman and Ginger Rogers and Ezio Pinza and all these wonderful performers singing Broadway shows, all written by Jews. That was the key. So whether it was Rodgers and Hammerstein or Lerner and Lowe or Gershwin, whatever it was, I put together a 30 or 40 minute presentation of these recordings. I came back to Jerusalem. I did my talk. I narrated it and then pressed the little play button on my cassette recording. And it was a different time then. Everyone listened to me playing a recording, and it was well received. The dean of the campus said, this would be a fun project to do publicly. Let's do a Havdalah event Saturday night. You can do your talk again and put the microphone of the sound system in the HUC chapel on your cassette recording, and everyone will sit in the room, listen to you talk, and then you'll press the play button and play the music. Okay, fine. Believe it or not, they actually liked it. And we did it another time. So I did 2 performances publicly with people who required tickets to get in, which is a joke. They didn't have to pay. I come back to Cincinnati. Somehow the news of my interest in this field prepared me for invitations that I received from the sisterhood of this temple and the brotherhood of that temple to come and do these shows. Okay, 2 or 3 of them, again, with recordings, and they were happy to listen to these great singers. I then got invited, and Robert, you'll understand this and laugh, I'm sure, at this thought. I got invited to the conservative synagogue, the largest conservative synagogue in Cincinnati, to do their Golden Ager Shabbat afternoon oneg. In other words, celebrating or do some kind of program. So I said, fine. I show up on that Saturday afternoon with my tape recorder, and I walk in, and the rabbi looks at me and he says, "Was ist das? What is this? You can't use a tape recorder in a conservative synagogue on Shabbat." And I said, that's my whole program. I just talk about these famous people singing. And he said, well, you can't do it. You'll have to sing it yourself. And I said, okay, I mean, I'm nowhere near as good a singer as Robert is a comedian and a rabbi, but I figured I'd do the best I can. And then he said, and by the way, since you didn't get here in time to do this, you can't use the microphone because you can't turn it on. It's a machine and you can't turn it on Shabbat. So suddenly I have literally 250 quite elderly people, no microphone, no music, and I'm doing this whole thing, a cappella with no sheet music and talking at the same time. So to paraphrase Tevye from Fiddler on the Roof, the way they heard and the way I sing, it was a perfect match. So they thought it was great, and it was a huge hit. And from then on, I ended up doing all these lectures all around the world, including the South, with me singing along, and then in many congregations with cantors or the choir. So my Temple Oseh Shalom people will remember I did a show for them at the big gala a couple of years ago. And as I said, I've done these all over the world. So two funny stories. It's not getting to the point you wanted to hear about, Robert, but I think you'll be recognize this as kind of a funny moment. I was doing an Australian, New Zealand tour of synagogues all around that part of the world. And one of the places I did was a very large retirement home, I think called the Maimonides Center in in Sydney. And the one huge mistake was that the organizer set up the cookies and punch at the tables right behind me. So this entire crowd of 300 people are looking somewhat at me, but mostly at the brownies that are on the table behind me. The concert's over and they, applauded very politely, and 299 of them went straight for the refreshments. And one lady came up to me and she said, "Rabbi, that was very good, but Frank Sinatra, you're not." So if nothing else, they got the cookies and the brownies, and the one very nice person was willing to talk with me. Anyway, the point being, I've had the privilege of taking this world of American popular music, all written by Jews, and all around the world. And whether it's England or France, Israel, Australia, New Zealand, as I said, in many, many places, Germany, trying to think of other countries, South America, I was down there as well, in Buenos Aires and in Rio. Anyway, the remarkable gift of Jews to American music is really world music as well. And one of the stories that I tell quite often that in my presentations, when Fiddler on the Roof opened, it was a big question mark who would want to go see a show about a guy who has all these daughters and talks to God, and it's not going to go, very Jewish. Well, of course, in its day, it was the longest running theatrical production in the history of American theater and around the world. So much so that the United States government sent a tour of Fiddler on the Roof to go around the world as an example of American popular culture. And it began in Eastern Europe, no surprise, Russia, and then Poland, and then moved its way across Europe toward England and Spain, and then ended its tour in Tokyo. And the reviewer, one of the newspapers in Tokyo, wrote the following words: "We cannot understand why Fiddler on the Roof is so popular in America because the story is so Japanese." And of course, the message was that it's about immigrants and it's about generations and the change from one generation to the other and about traditions and customs. So I think that's part of why the interest that people have in American music and American musical theater is worldwide, not just unique to our country. So that's what got me into rabbinical school. And through it, it was one of my great fundraisers for me to go do the sisterhood in itsy bitsy towns who thought I was a big deal, instead of getting famous people like Robert or other folks to come and entertain. And then I got to the profound moment of being asked, what was I going to write my rabbinic thesis about? And of course, rabbinic dissertations were in those days a couple of 100 pages. They were scholarly, they were with important collections of books and work in the library or whatever. So I went to my mentor and professor, a man by the name of Dr. Jacob Rader Marcus, who founded the American Jewish Archives, a name that is familiar to some of you who've been connected to HUC over the years, like B.H. Levy, who's on the Board of Governors, and Larry Pike, who is on the Board of Overseers, and others of you who are familiar with that school. And I said to him, I would like to write the first rabbinic thesis on the history of Jewish contribution to American popular music. And needless to say, this great scholar and historian looked at me somewhat askance and said, I don't think that's academic or serious enough. I said, well, let me tie it a little more tightly. What if I did the period from the very first published Jewish songwriter and did 100 years? Well, it turns out it was from 1840 to 1940. And I was able to produce a bibliography of hundreds of books, including many autobiographies by these various songwriters and historians and so on. Anyway, I was allowed to do that as my rabbinic thesis. And the result of that was the publication of my first book, and then the books that came afterward and articles that came afterward about the role of the Jewish contribution to American music, be it theater or popular music, Tin Pan Alley, and so on. So that was my great avocation. Couldn't have been a better thing to do than go to Music City in Nashville as a historian in the music world, albeit very different music. But one of the joys I had was to be appointed to the board of the Country Music Hall of Fame and the Country Music Foundation, which was a little weird, number one, being the only Jewish person and certainly being the only clergy person. So that allowed me to get to know so many of the country stars, many of whom I never even heard of, but the ones, many you'll know, Vince Gill and Dolly Parton and so on, they were all on this board. So the great joke was, because it's a very religious city, Nashville, at every event, every Hall of Fame event, someone had to give the prayer. Well, guess who was the only clergy person on the board? And so here they were, all these many very Christian people calling up to do their opening prayer. The member of our board, Rabbi Ken Kanter. And so I would do these prayers and get to sit next to Hank Snow or Dolly Parton or Vince Gill or all these other really amazing people. So that was yet another part of the joy of the rabbinate, was to not only have these wonderful congregational relationships, as I do in Bluffton and did in Nashville and Chattanooga, and having now spoken at Savannah several times over these decades, but to be a part of the music world. And that led me to a phone call that will always be special in my heart. And that is, after my work at HUC was concluded, B.H. Levy, with the goodness of his heart and maybe his heart in his throat, I don't know how enthusiastic, but anyway, he said, look, we know that you're no longer working with the college. Would you be willing to come for a 6-month basis as the interim director of the organization called the Society for Classical Reform Judaism, which, of course, having grown up in Chicago in classical reform temples, my grandparents were founders, that whole side of my family were founders of Sinai Temple in Chicago, one of the great so-called dowager synagogues of classical reform. I said I'd be delighted to. And of course, I had known BH and Margie from their work at the college and had met Larry, in fact, had dinner with him and with Doug at a dinner sponsored by the American Jewish Archives when they were in Cincinnati. So it was like coming back to good, wonderful friends. Anyway, as our time went forward, I said, you know what? I think we need to look at the name of this organization and the interpretation of that name in our modern world, more modern world, and to look at the vision and mission of what we're trying to do with it. And BH and Larry and Robert, who of course was a board member of this organization, and so many other people whom I know and respect, were willing to let us try this new name called Roots of Reform Judaism. For while many people don't know the term classical reform, and others are put off a little bit by the term society, meaning kind of an elitist perhaps feeling, that no one could argue that the great teachings of the 19th and 20th centuries of Reform Judaism and the prophetic voice of the early rabbis and great rabbis of our movement were connected to the prophetic message of Reform Judaism. And these are the roots of the Reform Judaism of today. So that's kind of my story in a maybe bigger nutshell than you had in mind, Robert, but it kind of gives some background and some interest. Mostly the lesson I've learned very powerfully is that what makes Judaism great and profound is not just the beliefs and things or the traditions or the customs and minhagim, it's the people. And it's why, going to Savannah and speaking at Mikveh Israel, or being in Bluffton and with my community and at Temple Oseh Shalom, or Atlanta, where Larry is a board member and past president, and other connections. First of all, you learn one of the lessons I used to teach every class at rabbinical school. Wherever you go, do not forget that everyone in your congregation is related to everybody else in the congregation. So you will find cousins wherever you go. So never speak ill of someone else in the community, because you're bound to be talking to their aunt or cousin or fraternity, sorority friend from college. And it's definitely true. It never fails. I was in Beijing 10 years ago to do the high holy days there. And at the end of the Rosh Hashanah service, their tradition was that the rabbi and the president stood and shook hands with everybody. So this young man comes up to me and he said, Rabbi Kanter, did you used to be the rabbi and the chaplain for Vanderbilt? And I said, well, yes, I did. He said, well, I was in ZBT at Vanderbilt and used to come in once a month to speak to ZBT about Jewish things. And I remember you from those days, all those years ago in Nashville. And as I say, it never fails that you run into somebody whom you know their cousin, or you did their nephew's wedding or their niece's wedding. And it's one of the great joys that I'm sure that, Robert, you experience and other rabbis do wherever we get to go. So that's a long story, a long answer, but I hope it maybe opens a few things for questions or comments.
Any questions before we continue? Let's say any questions. So before we get into the actual organization itself, would you return a little bit to, I want to make sure everybody understands the 19th century Reform Judaism and this kind of transition to, in many ways, a different form. A lot of people, I think, and when I think of Reform Judaism, think of yarmulkes or no yarmulkes, kosher, no kosher, sitting together. But there was a more important theme to the Reform movement in the 19th century, and talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, let me just say, for those of you who are Mikveh Israel folks, you cannot talk about the history of Reform Judaism without recognizing the incredible role that your congregation played in it. And I know Robert said, don't give them a history lesson. They know their history, and you have one of the great archives of any synagogue I've ever been to. In fact, the first time I was down in Savannah, I had a private tour by none other than B.H. Levy himself, and then came back the next time and had a similar tour in the archives having been redone. It's gorgeous, by Robert. And when my wife was down there, she got the VIP tour from Margie. You can't do any better than those folks to learn about the history of Savannah. But from the point of view of Reform Judaism, the Savannah story is so important to where Judaism began in America, that you think about the use of the introduction of organ music, you think about the introduction of the ritual of confirmation, you think about the ritual of the Union Prayer Book, which you still use on Shabbat morning, as those of you who are at services today are very well familiar. Not just the traditions and the minhag, the customs, but the great rabbis who served the congregation from the almost 200 years of Mikveh Israel now. And so you can't learn about Reform Judaism. And by the way, our students at HUC, through the work of the American Jewish Archives and others, are very much aware of what Savannah has meant to the history of Judaism, not just Reform Judaism, in North America, with Charleston and Savannah, and then the early other historic congregations in New York City, and so on. You are very much part of the heart of what has become Reform Judaism. So what was Reform? Well, let's begin with one thought. Yes, there was that question of, do I wear a yarmulke? Do I not wear a yarmulke? Maybe some of you remember visiting in New York City and going to Temple Emmanuel on East 65th Street. And there was a plaque as you walked in that said, please remove your hat as a sign of respect for God. And so they would make sure you took your yarmulke off when you went to Temple Emmanuel. Now that's no longer, that sign is no longer there. And many synagogues, even if they continued in more traditional classical reform customs, would wear yarmulkes, as I know Rabbi Haas does. But that was part of it. That was how the physical manifestation of reform would show itself. Did your synagogue have an organ or did it not? Did it have a mixed choir like men and women together? Did it not? Did it have a chazan, a cantor? Did it not? Did you have a yarmulke or talit, or did you not? Did the rabbi wear a rabbinic robe, or did he or she not? These were the kind of outward representations of reform. But the true underpinnings of reform was not what you did, and maybe even not what you ate. I remember sending a rabbinical student who grew up more traditionally than I did, down to our student pulpit in New Iberia, Louisiana. Now you may laugh at that, but it was one of the two original congregations that had hired a student from Cincinnati every month or every 2 weeks. They would go down to New Iberia, and the other original one was in Portsmouth, Ohio, which is kind of on the Ohio-West Virginia border. And that began, believe it or not, in 1883. And those two congregations have had student rabbis ever since into 2020, 2019. Of course, 2020, we didn't send students anywhere with the COVID issues. But the point being, I sent him down there and he calls me, and forgive the language, I know it's Shabbat, he said, Ken, what the hell were you thinking? The first night they took me out for dinner was for lobster and shellfish on Shabbat. And I said, well, did you find some fish to eat? He said, yeah, I didn't starve. Well, by the end of that year, he loved them and they loved him. And he was able to fit in his more traditional points of view with the fact that their biggest fundraiser of the year was the crawfish boil and sponsored by the temple. So that was a classical reform of the outward traditions, but the beliefs and the message, which I know is what Rabbi Haas is referring to, those lessons began as the early reform movement in America. Remember, reform began in Germany in a town called Gießen about 1803. So it's been almost 220 years. But the point was that the great messages of reform were the prophetic teachings of these early rabbis: social justice and treating diverse people appropriately, and caring for the poor, and caring for the widow, and caring for the orphan. Those three phrases, which are so much a part of our biblical understanding of the unempowered parts of our community, the widow, the orphan, and the stranger, those were very much part of the foundational teachings of reform as early as the 1840s and 50s. You look in the 1860s, who were the great rabbis opposed to the racism and slavery? You had some of these were the great rabbis of the reform movement. Now, by the way, it may surprise you to know that there were some rabbis who were in great synagogues, even in New York City, who endorsed the concept of slavery because they found it in the Bible. A rabbi by the name of Morris Raphael, one of the great rabbis of New York City, was in favor of slavery, but not slavery where you owned people, but the biblical view of slavery. That's a whole nother conversation that I know Rabbi Haas could do beautifully in an adult education conversation. But some of these other values that are so much a part of the great underpinnings of classical reform are the views and the beliefs we have now. And I would urge you, if you want to really know more about this, there are 3 documents you could read that are all online, and I recommend them as a way to begin. And they are called the great platforms of Reform Judaism. The first one was the Pittsburgh platform in 1885. The next famous one was the Columbus platform in 1937. And then the centennial one was again done in Pittsburgh when the CCIR met there. And you can see the values that have changed within Reform Judaism, but more importantly, the values that remain unchanged, that are the kind of the permanent teachings of our Reform Jewish community and synagogues and rabbis. Things have changed. The role of Israel has changed in so many ways. The role of women, that was a much later addition. Other traditions, the use of Hebrew in the early traditions of the 1885 platform, the Pittsburgh platform, Hebrew was clearly not an important part of their ritual service, and it became more so over the years. So there are things that have changed, but the basic teachings and lessons of Reform remain strong, and the undergirding of what we all believe, whatever our synagogues are, in the sense of Reform Judaism. So that's kind of a beginning point, maybe, Robert, as to where you were hoping to go with that.
Oh, I think that's perfect. Any questions before we continue? All right. So you spent all those years as a pulpit rabbi. What made you decide to enter into a new career? And then what made you decide to enter into a new career after that?
Well, one of them had to do, in some ways, personally, my late wife, Wendy, had become very, very ill at this point in her life and in my career. And so as I earned, or I should say, I was honorarily given the DD award, which is called the Doctor of Divinity, but maybe less respectfully, those of us old geezers referred to it as the didn't die degree, meaning you've been a rabbi 25 years and have not embarrassed the community. So HUC would recognize that 25 years of duration. It was also called the Doctor of Duration doctorate. So anyway, the point being, I earned this degree, and Wendy was having some rough time with her metastatic breast to bone cancer, when the college called me up and said, would you be interested or willing to come back to Cincinnati and to be part of admissions and part of the campus? And the dean's comment, Dean, whom I had gone to school with at the time, he was older than I, but we were at school at the same time. He said to me, you have been a congregational rabbi longer than our entire faculty added together, because I'd been a congregational rabbi 25 years. And obviously the men and women on the faculty at HUC were brilliant scholars and perhaps not as involved in the practical rabbinate as I had been. So I came back to Cincinnati, worked first as the head of admissions, and then a couple of months later became the director of the rabbinical school. And then a few months after that was named associate dean as well. So it put me into a lot of these wonderful opportunities to teach, to work with the faculty, to be part of the community. So as I said to them when I interviewed, my hope was to try to make HUC more of a feeling of a congregation, of supporting each other, of the generations being part of each other's lives. And I don't know that I achieved all those things, but it was certainly a marvelous experience for those 15 or 16 years. Then, as I mentioned earlier, the position in which I held, which was a non-tenured position, was eliminated on the different campuses. And that's when BH graciously called and saved the day to invite me to come and work with the society now, Roots of Reform. So that's kind of, I don't know that they're different careers as much as different facets of the same career, but they've been wonderful. And being able to sit down with students, as I taught in the senior seminar every year, and gave them some of the wisdom and experience of having learned from previous temple presidents and the challenges of interfaith work or interracial work or whatever. It was great to be able to say, well, I used to do this in my experience, and maybe that will help you when you go into your careers once you leave rabbinical seminary.
That's great. And again, the support is needed. Now, you were offered the part of Roots of Reform Judaism. So what led you to take the position, and what have you been doing beyond just cementing and making friends? And what is the vision of Roots Reform Judaism? And maybe explain exactly what it's for. You mentioned a little bit, but
yeah, sure. Well, I think with both Larry and BH on this Zoom session right now, BH being the first president of this organization, and he and Larry, among others, founders of it, and then you, Robert, as a board member, and Margie, of course, Margie Levy, very much part of all this. I'm sort of in the way of, it's like asking, how did you write the Declaration of Independence when Jefferson and all those people are on the call with you at the same time? So it's a teeny bit chutzpahdik, if you don't mind that word. But the values and lessons of classical reform were very much a part of my growing up and my life as a rabbi. And I think it's fair to say, and your community at Mikveh Israel knows this better than almost anybody, that if I were to start the prayer, may the time not be distant, O God, when your name shall be worshiped in all the earth, most of the people at Mikveh Israel, and so many Jews who grew up in the Reform community, could finish that whole prayer because we know it by heart. Or grant us peace, thy most precious gift, O eternal. Those prayers are greater than the Union Prayer Book. They're greater than Mishkan or the other, gates of blue or gates of red. These are prayers that are kind of in the hearts and souls of so many Jews who grew up with those words and those messages and those teachings. And that language and the ability to inspire people through English language, through Jewish prayer, through prayers that are beautifully written, were very much a part of the classical reform heritage. The second part, my love of music isn't just Gershwin and Rodgers and Hammerstein and people like that, Stephen Sondheim or Stephen Schwartz, but it's also the composers like Max Janowski or Zulzer or Adler. And these people were writing great choral music that are as much a part of our heritage as Debbie Friedman or as Jeff Klepper and Danny Freelander or Dan Nichols.
Kelly Blackmore.
Right. All of these great composers and songwriters of our present day. And so to be able to be part of an organization that espoused and lifted up the great liturgy and the great music of our heritage for a modern generation that frankly didn't know all those things was very important. But at the same time, maybe one of the reasons why I recognized the need for us to pivot a little bit in what we were doing was that the world of the prayer book in Reform synagogues has definitely changed. Many congregations are not even using prayer books anymore. They're using video worship, on screens in synagogues or online. Many congregations, many are writing their own prayer books so that the use of, one prayer book for all Reform temples is over with and has been for probably 40 years. And so if you look around the country, you will see whether it's Wise Temple in Cincinnati or Temple Israel in Detroit or Emmanuel in New York City or San Francisco's these congregations have written their own localized prayer book so that
Who knew that?
Pardon?
But who knew that?
It's true. And so, I have a wall, a collection of all these prayer books from all around the country. Now, much of the liturgy in them you would find very familiar because it came from the Union Prayer Book or other Reform liturgy sources, but they're writing their own. So the use of one prayer book for everybody to use is something that's no longer happening. Secondly, the creation of prayer books that are all-inclusive is another thing that many congregations are moving away from. So I went to our distinguished board, of which several of you are members, and said, let's try to create somewhat more modernized language, but in the same feeling and the same style as the great prayer books of the Union Prayer Book, whether it's from the 1890s all the way to 1960, and then the prayer book since then. So we have been able to create a number of booklets for different usages that are based on the Sinai UPB that you use at Mikveh Israel on Shabbat morning. But these booklets range from a Shiva booklet, a beautiful collection of meditations. I sent an email out to 60 or 70 rabbis and said, send me material that you've written, and cantors too, by the way, rabbis and cantors. Send me some material you've written that has been especially beautiful and meaningful for shut-ins or for folks in the hospital or for nursing home people. And we put them together into a beautiful book that's now had some significant interest with hospitals around the country to give them away to patients. So that's another of these booklets. We've now written 10 of them. And the two newest ones that are just in the process, book 8 and 9, I should say, are books for children.
Oh, cool.
2 to 4-year-olds and 6 to 8-year-olds, both written by a rabbi and his wife, who's a nationally known book illustrator. And those are going to be coming out in the next few weeks over the summer. And then the 10th of the formal series is a book that is the history of Reform Judaism through the documents. Remember, I mentioned the 3 platforms. Well, it's those things, a timeline, a couple of essays that would be perfect if I have the chance to come down to Savannah sometime again and talk to you, to give these booklets
Anytime.
out someday. These will be another beautiful part of our heritage with the messages and lessons that we talked about before into a giveaway booklet that people can enjoy to learn about the roots of reform. And I don't use that in the title, but it's the roots, the historical roots of reform. So this is another of the components that we're doing. At the same time, encouraging congregations around the country and finding out. One of our next projects is sending out an email to about 200 rabbis and cantors to find out which of these rabbis or congregations ever do a kind of classical reform service. So obviously, Savannah, you're going to be at the top of our list. You're probably the most regular congregation in the country, i.e. do it the most regularly, to have a weekly Union Prayer Book style service. Other congregations are monthly. Some of them may do them for special events, whatever, but we're trying to gather that information, because one of the things that we also are is a resource of information for people who don't know where to ask. So we'll get phone calls or emails or requests. You know, I live in so-and-so. Is there a place near us that does reform, a classical service? We want to have that information to be able to help them as well. So that's another component, to be a resource, to be a place where people can purchase these booklets for various usages, whether it's for the family at home or a loved one who is a shut-in, whatever. At the same time, to create curriculum for synagogues, confirmation classes, and so on, about the history of reform. So we're working with the American Jewish Archives. We're working with some of the great historians around the United States to create materials. And this season, as in right after the holidays, you'll be able to see on Facebook a number of kind of TED Talks for Reform Judaism, little short vignettes. Sometimes it's about a particular object. So we're working with one of the great museums in New York City to do a 5-minute illustration of an object and what it means and so on. We're hoping that Margie and BH will share some of the incredible Judaica that they have in their family's history. We're working with the American Jewish Archives. Again, Robert, I already asked you about sharing some of the materials from the Mikveh Israel archives to be part of this. So we want people to know that Reform Judaism and these classic values are vital and current and lively and looking forward as much as appreciating, recognizing the past. So that's another possibility. Now, in no way am I competing with you, but we also have Shabbat services online that are recorded. In fact, Robert, you're one of them, and we're grateful about that. You did a beautiful sermon for one of these services. And BH and Larry are both on there. And I've mentioned that Benjamin Levy, a proud son of your congregation, is another one of our board members, is working with us in the field that he loves so much, even more than, I don't know about more than, but comparable to his medical world, and that's the music world. So we have been able to produce. And
he's a very big fan of music, yeah.
Yes, he certainly is. Recording music done by a marvelous choir from the College of Charleston of 24 singers and organist, pianist, violinist, flautist, etc. And that's part of our services as well. So, you know, when you don't have the opportunity to get to Mikveh Israel or to Temple Osei Shalom or the temple in Atlanta or wherever you may come from, people watching today, you can enjoy these services if you look at one word, rootsofreform.org, and there's both high holiday, meaning Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, 3 Shabbat services, a new one for Shabbat coming up in August, and then new high holy day ones being recorded for this high holy day season. And we hope this is for people who are shut-ins or not able or maybe not aware of all the availabilities of resources as you're doing, Robert, with the services online for Mikveh Israel. So we've had hundreds of people who've been watching these as well. And that's another part of the vision of what we hope Roots of Reform Judaism can be doing going forward.
And what do you see for the future of Roots of Reform Judaism?
Well, you know what? I don't have the gift of prophecy, so I can't predict that.
If you did, we'd be going to Vegas, just to let you know.
Right, exactly. I would sell tickets to that, and we could have a joint fundraiser for all of our organizations. I think it's safe to say that our movement is somewhat moving away from the focus it used to have on what made reform great and moving into either post-denominationalism or non-denominationalism. And I think many of our rabbinical students are happy about that it's becoming more and more reformative, as in a mixture of conservative and reform. But I know that Roots of Reform Judaism's commitment is to say that we cannot lose what made reform great and what made reform unique. And whether it be through the resources of education or ritual or liturgy or the uplifting of music, the broadening of knowledge of our rabbinical students and cantorial students as they leave their training and go forward to know what it is we are as Reformed Jews, we are committed to that. We are committed to supporting congregations that are recognizing the greatness of that Reform liturgy, whether they've written their own in that same format or using the Sinai UPB or other materials comparably. We are committed to that as well. And I think as the movement moves in a direction that perhaps is further away from those messages, we're going to be there and say, you know what, we're here, we've got the resources, we've got the scholars, we have the materials for you. We will be there, not as a safeguard against what's happening for the future, but as a parallel resource for the reform movement, for the people who find their connection in liturgy that's more English or more accessible if they don't know any Hebrew. Certainly for interfaith couples where there is an issue of one partner, knowing Hebrew and the other one not so much, to find a place where they can worship comfortably and feel accepted and feel that it's open to them as well. So that's another broad area, and that's the interfaith work that is so much a part of what Reform Judaism has always been, and we want it to continue to do that as well.
And I think that's a group of very important things that you mentioned. You mentioned a lot. Does anybody want to have any questions for him, by the way? Flossie.
Hi, Rabbi Kanter.
Hi, Flossie.
Good to see you. Thank you for your time. A few things came up as you were talking. One, I find it interesting that the pandemic went and turned a lot of things around and made a positive in many ways in seeing a way to reach Jews who maybe weren't going to synagogue, but here they attended. It was a joke with Rabbi Haas, the bottoms were pajamas or whatever, but they were there. And I really like that idea when you say the TED Talks, the Zooms, still continuing because you're reaching a group that maybe weren't coming and we don't want to lose them. So I thank you. That's very, very positive. One or two questions. How do you find the rabbinic student today compared to the rabbinic student of the past? Do you see a difference, or just how they're being taught is different? I'm just curious of that.
That's a really great question. I can't give you an in-depth answer in the sense that obviously every student is different and every student brings something different to the table. But I'll tell you one of the things that will surprise you. In the last 2 or 3 years, at least in Cincinnati, a sizable percentage, and I mean in the case of 1 year, I remember 8 out of the 11 were the product of intermarriages, meaning one of their parents was not born Jewish or wasn't Jewish at the time. So that is a very different tradition, a very different representation, I mean, than maybe 50 years ago, where, well, I was 50 years ago, 80 years ago, that these people were the children of immigrant Jews who had come to America, and rabbinical school was a place for them to get training, okay? So the reality of the diversity of interfaith is a huge change. Another one, very obvious. Next year, we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the ordination of the first American woman rabbi, Rabbi Sally Presant. And so now we're having a situation where I can't speak to each campus, but certainly in the campuses, the majority of the students are women. And I don't mean that it's 80-20, but it might be 55-45 or 51-49. In other words, there are a lot of wonderfully gifted women rabbis. And in our classes, some of them, there were more women than men. The third grouping that in my career, I was ordained in 1979-80, so it's 41, almost 42 years ago. The recognition of LGBT students as rabbis is something that is now a given rather than controversial. And now we have a number of transgender rabbinical students. So the realities of the society are reflected just as clearly in the HUC world. And, you know, I know Margie Levy's on the board of the URJ and our national movement, and certainly Rick Jacobs and the leaders, Eric Yaffe and Rabbi Schindler, all these who followed him, were deeply committed to this opening of the door to welcoming all parts of the Jewish world. And so we are certainly seeing that. Now that's one kind of collective difference. The second thing, the intermarriage component has impacted the traditional nature of our students. So for example, you would think if with one parent is non-Jewish and one is Jewish, that they're going to come less traditional. But in some cases, they're making up for lost time, so to speak, by being more traditional than maybe their parents are. Now, I can't speak to that across the board, but I've seen that in a number of students. And then they get into the real world of congregational life and say, okay, this is maybe where I was. Like my friend who was who didn't eat it, but was serving a congregation with the crawfish boil. And that would have been appalling to him. Well, by the time he left there, he said, I don't do it, but I respect what they're doing in terms of their Jewish life. So that's another component of appreciation of diversity. What students are being taught, that one I can give you substantively, because I did a presentation for our Cincinnati Board of Overseers on the history of the curriculum of HUC every 30 years, 1880, 1910, 1940, 1970, and the year 2000, which is when I gave the talk. And in 1880, what the students learned was 80% text, Talmud, Bible, Hebrew, Mishnah, Midrash, all that sort of stuff, and 20% practical Judaism, meaning how do you teach all that stuff? Because in those days, the text was more important than how to present it. Every 30 years since then, what started like this, like this. So when Rabbi Haas was at school, and granted that's quite a number of years after I was, the practical rabbinic portion of what the students were taught was way higher than it was 30 years before that, or each of these times I did a study. Until now, what we see is that how do you do a bar mitzvah? How do you train to do an intake of a wedding couple or a funeral family? How do you serve as the rabbi is as important as being able to translate Talmud or teach, do a biblical text. Not that they're less important, but the focus is more on the practical part. We've certainly seen that in the last years of change. By the way, as an example, every rabbinical student in Cincinnati and most on the New York and LA campuses are required to get a degree or a first section of CPE, Clinical Pastoral Education. What does that mean? How do you go to a hospital? How do you visit a sick person? How do you work as a chaplain for people of other faiths? That's a requirement for us. It's something that our colleagues at the other seminaries are just moving to, that it becomes a requirement for them. So that's a big difference.
I still remember when I was in rabbinical school, Richard Levy came out on the cover. I forgot which magazine it was, maybe in Reform Judaism. And he's wearing the tallis and the tefillin and the yarmulke, and it created such an uproar. He was the dean of the rabbinical school in LA for a while. And
he was my colleague position-wise in LA as I was.
Exactly.
And that was the cover of Reform Judaism magazine. May it rest in peace. For those of you who remember that wonderful magazine. And it was, you talk about a controversy. That was crazy.
Yeah, I didn't even understand. I just pretty much started, so I understood. I didn't realize how big a deal it was to have him do that. He had just been also he'd done it while he was president of the CCAR. That's why it was such a big deal.
Right.
So which is the governing body of Reform rabbis. So any other questions we have, Flossie?
First, I want to compliment the two rabbis on their ties. They're they're keeping us awake here. Rabbi Kanter, one thing surprises me you didn't mention. Where does Israel fit in to the curriculum?
Well, as I said at the beginning, when we talked about the different platforms, Israel, from its early platform, had no role, Zionism. And then in the 1930s, remember, it's 1937. This is before the war begins in Europe in 39. And Israel is Zionism is part of that platform. Then in the 100th anniversary, it's very much a part of it. But from Roots of Reform's perspective, Israel is a very important part. We support the earliest classical Reform temple in Jerusalem. I go each year, and my predecessor, Rabbi Howard Berman, went to Jerusalem to meet with the new students in the cantorial education and rabbinic programs. So while we don't take a stand per se on Zionism as a political statement, pro or con, we're very much pro and supportive of Israel and the program. But remember, Israel never had a classical Reform Judaism. It barely had reform until the more recent decades, which is why we are supportive of the congregation in Jerusalem and in Tel Aviv and so on. and encouraging. I go and meet with the Israeli-born rabbinic students, meaning they're in the Israel program. They don't know what classical reform or what the roots of Reform Judaism are. And for me to share this with them, and they say, whoa, this is exactly what I believe in, is opening a whole nother set of doors. So I think that's a pretty meaningful answer. I know, Robert, we're coming to the end. I want to tell
if people are okay with it, I'm fine. There's no rush.
Well, I don't want anyone to miss lunch. If it's a choice of me or lunch, no one should pick me. I want to tell you one very funny Nashville story. This is 1981 or 2, let's say. And I was preparing our first graders for the consecration service. And you have consecration at Mikveh Israel?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yes, we do.
So it's these 6-year-olds who are going and be part of this little service, and we give them a little Torah, and it's kind of the beginning of their Sunday school training. And we had a wonderful young man whose name was Caleb. And Caleb's father is a doctor at one of the medical schools in Nashville. And his wife, and Caleb's mom, who's African-American, I don't remember what her work was, but the little boy comes up to me and says, this is 1981 or 2, he said, my grandpa has sent me a yarmulke to wear at consecration. And I'm thinking, this is going to be a problem, because our temple at that time was you have to take your hat off at services. So I said to the little boy, don't worry, everything's going to be fine. I call up the senior rabbi. Thankfully, I'm not the senior rabbi. Someone else is the boss. And he said, well, let's bring it to the board. Now think about this. For this one little kid to wear yarmulke, it had to go to the board. All right. He said, you know what? I don't care what the board says. The kid should do it. Fine. I go back and see Caleb the next week, and I said, that's going to be great. We're delighted for you to wear it. And he came in, he said, Grandpa got it in Israel, and I get to wear it. Fine. A couple weeks later, he says, Grandpa's coming to the service. I'm thinking, thank God he'll have that yarmulke on. Well, who was Grandpa? Cab Calloway.
Wow.
And here he is, Cab Calloway, at our services for Shabbat in Nashville, Tennessee. Cab Calloway, for those of you who are younger than me and never heard of him, the Heidi-Ho man, one of the greatest entertainers of vaudeville and theater. He was in Porgy and Bess on Broadway. I mean, a huge star. So here is Grandpa Cab Calloway coming to see his little Jewish grandson with his Israeli kippah at temple in Nashville, Tennessee for consecration. Okay, fine.
It's a beautiful story.
Here's the rest of it. Got to hear the end. At the end of this, he gets there, and Caleb says, I want you to meet my rabbi who likes all these old songs like you do, Grandpa. And Cab Calloway, who is dressed to the nines, as you would assume, comes in and starts talking to me in Yiddish.
Oh my gosh.
And I said to him, I hate to admit this, I can read Yiddish, I can write Yiddish, but I don't speak it. And he says to me in Yiddish, translates, what are you, a goy? I said, apparently so. And I said, how do you know Yiddish? And he said, I worked for decades in the Borscht Belt up in the Catskills. He said, all of us spoke Yiddish. The servers, the waiters, everybody spoke Yiddish because all the guests spoke Yiddish. And he said, so I speak fluent Yiddish as well. And that was the end of my moment, except he was very proud of his grandson doing his little prayer in Hebrew with his Israeli yarmulke and his most famous grandpa sitting in the congregation.
That's a great story. Jeff, top that story, Jeff.
Not a story, but two other very
Aretha Franklin and Louis Armstrong. You met them together.
Right. Two other very famous was Louis Armstrong and Colin Powell.
That's right.
Yes.
That's right.
He's from
Well,
the
both
Bronx.
Yiddish speakers.
Right.
Colin Powell learned his Yiddish because as a kid, he worked for a Jewish man who owned a furniture store in the Bronx.
Right,
and he learned fluent Yiddish.
right.
Now, just to give you one more moment, has nothing to do with this.
No.
Can you name the most famous, if you'll allow the phrase, Shabbos Goy? You know that word? Shabbos
Yes.
Goy, meaning someone who would turn the lights on for an Orthodox family or whatever. The most famous one that I know of, Elvis Presley, who lived in Mississippi in a 2-level home, the downstairs
Right.
level of which was owned by Orthodox Jews. And Elvis would come down and tear the toilet paper and turn on and turn off their lights on Shabbat. He got paid, not on Shabbat, by this family in Mississippi. And he is, I'm sure, the most famous Shabbos Goy that I know of. So on that cheerful thought,
What? One other rabbi, I don't know if you know this one, Senator Cory Booker,
From New
was
Jersey.
from New Jersey, was once president of Hillel when he was a Rhodes Scholar in England. So there's a background story to it, but
that must be a good one.
it is a very good story. So I believe he also speaks,
Yiddish.
Yiddish because
Abyssal Yiddish, huh?
yeah, abyssal at least. But being a co-president of Hillel is a very interesting story.
Yes. Well, this is as far away off the subject as Rabbi Haas ever could have imagined.
I think it's great. We just get to learn a little about you, learn a little bit about your views. This is all good stuff. If only if we could figure out how we can make Lady Gaga Jewish, I think that would be the only thing that would top this off.
Well, it's when Madonna was learning her studies in Israel. You got to think about that. I only say in closing that that all of you who are listening to us and watching this today should be extraordinarily proud of what your congregation represents and means to the greater Jewish world, and certainly to the greater Reformed Jewish world, and the service that your rabbi provides not only for you, but for so many of us who are his colleagues, and in my case, gratefully, his friends. It's a blessing to be part of this today, and to have BH and Margie and Larry, who are so much a part of my work professionally, and the Schwartzes and the Caffeys and others of you who might be listening or watching from my Osei Shalom family. It's really wonderful to have just mishpacha on our service this morning and this afternoon, and a huge thank you to Rabbi Haas for this privilege.
Well, it's our privilege to have you. As I said, this will stay in perpetuity on our YouTube page. Such a pleasure to have you on the show, as we all can tell, and we all knew beforehand. Very charismatic, very knowledgeable, and hopefully we'll see you in person one of these days if you're up for it, because obviously I think we're all, are you going back into?
Yes, I think we're starting in-person services in Bluffton in July.
Oh, good. Well, if you ever want, what Flossie?
I'm sorry, Rabbi Kanter, did you say in July they're
I
going?
think unless they've changed, that was what I was told last.
Oh.
Good.
So we'll see.
Well,
But I fly into Savannah every time, so I wave as I keep driving out the interstate.
It was such a joy to have you here. Good luck to you. If people are more interested in learning about Roots of Reformed Judaism, could you give that website again?
One word, rootsofreform.org.
Spelled just like it sounds.
Yep.
It's a wonderful organization, a growing organization, some really top-notch people to ensure that we keep this, I guess what they call, what you said, obviously the prophetic viewpoint, which is so important. So thank you again, Rabbi. Just such a pleasure to have you on. We'll see you here. I know you're coming in the fall, hopefully for our board meeting. So we'll see you then. And from you and us here at Congregation McVisral, thank you very much. We will not be having a speaker in July, but we'll continue in August. So stay safe, everyone. And thanks again, Rabbi Kanter.
Thank you all.
Take care.
Shabbat shalom.
Thanks, everybody.
We'll see you in July.
I hope so.
I hope so too.
I hope so too.
All righty.
Bye, guys.